The number of people that I talk to who will say, yep, I just quit my job and I'm going to work on this full time. And then they say what they're working on. And inside I'm like, oh no, can you go back?
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
I'm Scotty Allen.
Chris wasn't available to join us this week, but we have friend of the pod, Scotty Allen. He listened to our episode from last week about different sources of funding, and he has thoughts that he wants to share. So we've invited him onto the podcast to give a rebuttal and actually have a really deep conversation about what it means to be a founder, what are the risks, and how to make that personal decision, given your own strengths and weaknesses, about knowing the game you want to play and understanding what the consequences are for you. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Looking forward to getting into it right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Now, just before we get into it, I need to remind you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. This podcast is free, and we would love to keep it that way, but it takes a lot of work to do that. And so we need your help to keep growing the podcast so we can attract fantastic sponsors, fantastic guests, and keep doing what we're doing. So all we ask you to do is to follow us and subscribe to us in your favorite listening app and on YouTube. Give us a rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and give us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. Thanks so much. It means a huge amount to us. Now on with the show. Scotty, I understand you listened to our episode from last week about different types of funding sources for startups, and you had a bit of beef with our section on bootstrapping. So tell us why we're wrong.
First of all, apologies to my car radio for having to yell at it while you guys were saying wrong things. But you and I have had these discussions before, and I think we actually agree on most things. It's more, I think, what didn't get said in that segment that is something that is frustrating to me as someone who works with founders that are really trying to get started. And that is, like, I completely agree that bootstrapping can be turn into a delusion. It can turn into people wasting a lot of their own money when they really don't have something. But the reality is that a lot of early stage founders do exactly that same thing, chasing funding. And so that, that piece of being your own angel investor, which I always put question marks about, because ultimately, it's your money and you're probably not going to get it back. But I think that there are a lot of people that hear things like that and go, right, I can't do it on my own. I need funding, and don't understand what's involved in that or how hard it is to find, how not all ideas actually are VC fundable. And I think we can send people down the wrong track by thinking if you just work hard enough, long enough, put enough of your own money in, eventually someone's going to recognize that and give you money. And it doesn't always work that way.
No, I completely agree. So as usual, yes, I think, Scotty, despite all of your yelling at our episode, we fundamentally agree on a bunch of stuff here. And I think in having the debate and sort of breaking it down, we can maybe help refine what founders really need to be thinking about. Because first of all, let's start with an area where I'm pretty confident that we are on the same page, which is around risk concentration. What I was trying to say, and I think Chris was also trying to say in the previous episode, is that bootstrapped founders often take on a much higher risk concentration, right? Because they're putting in their own money, their own time, they're doing it all on their own. They're effectively taking a negative salary, whereas funded founders can often spread the risk with their investors and can pay themselves some sort of salary, even if it's below a market salary and so on. And so they're taking less risk. And I think, if I understand correctly, your objection there is to that slightly glib way of saying, oh, it's like if you can take funding as though it's just there for the taking.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not.
The funding ATM does not exist yet.
So for a lot of people, getting funded is not an option. And I think you're saying is that it is dangerous for people to delude themselves that it is an option for them.
I think, and maybe this, comes from the way that we glamorize the success stories, is that people often have a notion that any idea can turn into a unicorn if you just try hard enough, etc. And the reality is that there are ideas that are interesting, that sound like they would solve a problem, but ultimately aren't backed up by a commercial model. And you don't really have to build anything sometimes to work that out. You can do that through easy validation, market research. Don't quit your day job until you've got some traction, which is not the sexy way, and it's not what VCs like, but it actually is a very legit way of validating a business and managing, de-risking that part of it.
It's interesting. You say it's not what VCs like, and of course, it's dangerous to paint all VCs with one brush. And often, the first round of funding is going to come from angels. I don't like calling it a family and friend round because that's very privileged.
Yeah,
not everyone has family and friends who can invest in their startups. But in any case, the question is, what is attractive to investors, and also what's attractive to investors perhaps in different markets. I think the idea of de-risking is really important, and I think has probably become more important since the ZIRP, zero interest rate bubble kind of burst, and investors are often looking for more signs of traction before they invest. And so I know what Chris was saying, to speak for Chris from the previous episode, to view bootstrapping as a stage makes a lot of sense, right? To say, okay, I'm going to put in a bit of time and my own money before I raise any funding to get things to the point where I can legitimately raise funding. And yeah, perhaps there are a few things that are unspoken there, which is, for example, to your point, Scotty, is what if I do those things and the idea isn't fundable? I still can't raise funding. What should I do then?
Look, I think that there are things that we just don't talk about enough in this space, that when someone comes in fresh, and often like myself, I've worked in startups. I've been the first product manager in things that have become successful. I've worked in unicorns, but before I had started my first business, there was stuff that I had not experienced. And when I started listening to the content that was out there, I started reading, it really felt like starting a degree in third year. I was like, I'm new. I've missed the beginning of this. We're talking about, your stages to unicorn, and I don't even have a donkey. And so I think that there are then assumptions that are laid in there that we don't tell people. You don't have to chase funding. Funding is for people that have got an idea that has high growth potential to maximize return. And if what you want to do is actually solve a problem that you're really passionate about and make a difference, make a living, you can do that in ways that don't require either the same level of funding or that you could actually do through this other great source of revenue we don't talk about enough called customers, right?
Which we did talk about in the previous episode.
You did. Yes, you did. You did so well until the bootstrap bit. I was like, I love this. I'm going to make everyone listen to it. And then I was yelling at my radio. And again, it's not so much because of what was said. It's because I think people don't necessarily understand that they have options. And so that piece, the number of people that I talk to who will say, yep, I just quit my job and I'm going to work on this full time. And then they say what they're working on. And inside I'm like, oh no, can you go back? Is it too late to because the pressure that you create on yourself when you then put in that environment, it's very sexy. It's very like, yeah, we're going to do this. But how often does that happen where people jump out and do that and then realize either that they don't know how to find funding, that their idea isn't fundable, that they're not fundable because they don't have a CV.
Pedigree.
And so then they have to kind of jump back into the day job, and their idea, which may have actually had something to it, kind of dies along with it. And I think that's that element of the unseasoned founder, and even people who have had a lot of business experience or worked in startups at later stages don't know what day one is like. And so you really, until you're responsible for funding the money, you don't know where money comes from. It's just kind of there. And if you're in a funded startup, it's often spent very freely. And so, understanding the math of all that and how you can actually give yourself more runway by at least starting bootstrapping is something I think we need to talk about more.
Let's try to break this down into a bit of a sort of mental framework, Scotty, right? Which is at the very early stages, even at later stages, but especially at the very early stages, most startups fail.
Yeah.
I think we're both saying the same thing here, right?
Yes.
And so given that, as somebody who wishes to be a founder or somebody who is a founder, how do you make the right decisions given that fact? And, I read a book that I really loved by a guy called Philip Tetlock. It's called Super Forecasting, right? And this is a guy who studied who are people who are actually really good at making predictions about the future. That they're not journalistic pundits. They're not those sorts of people. They are people who make good data-driven predictions about the future, and they are accurate more than other people. And he was studying what makes these people accurate. And one of the big things that they do is that they take the base rate into account, meaning instead of, jumping straight into what is the probability that a given government will fall in a given year? So, what's the probability that, the Russian government will collapse next year? That's the sort of questions that they were being asked, right? The good forecasters, before jumping in and talking about Russia and geopolitics and so on, they go to their history books and they look up how long does a typical system of government last before it collapses, right? Maybe it's about 100 years. So that means that the base rate for a regime collapsing in any given year is about 1%. And then you take that 1% and you modify it based on existing circumstances. But what most people do is they completely neglect the base rate and they jump straight into what special things do I know about the circumstance, right? And that leads to much less accurate forecasts. Now, why have I gone on that tangent? It's because the base rate for startups is a very high failure rate. And instead of saying, well, but I'm different because I'm me and I'm special and I'm clever and I understand the market. Well, you know what? Everybody else thought that about themselves too. And yet still, most of their startups failed, right? So you have to go in. If you want to be accurate in forecasting the future of your startup, you have to acknowledge to yourself that it's probably going to fail. Then you go to that decision point early on. You look at your personal circumstances and you say to yourself, what do I do? What is the right set of decisions for me personally, given that my startup is likely to fail? And, I think, Scotty, when I talk to you offline, people, founders who have put way too much of themselves, of their money into their startup, and then they start falling into this sunk cost sort of pattern, right? And it can be heartbreaking to see people just chasing good money after bad and, watching their dreams go up in flames in this really painful way. So given all that, how do you wish they would consider evaluating their risk?
Whenever I hear it's the Uber for or the Airbnb for cat litter or lawnmowers, whatever, I automatically get nervous because, we know that those startups validated in really manual, non-scalable ways to work out if people would pay before they built the big, behemoth. And I think that we're so focused now on wanting to start building something right away that we don't do the steps that we should do, first of all, to work out, are we building something that actually, knowing what the failure rate is, we want to have some degree of evidence that says that this has commercial potential before we start throwing real money into it. And so the mistake I think that a lot of people make is that they start writing code and building stuff before they've done any of that research. And I liken it to, if you decide you want to build a house, you don't invite a builder to bring some materials and start riffing on your block of land to, see if it works. You actually do designs and, decide if you like it, but also, is this going to fall over and all that good stuff before anybody pours a slab or touches a nail. There's a lot that you can do in both research and rapid prototyping without actually having to do development. And I think that we often bring in developers too early in the piece. A developer's job is not to validate your business idea. I've worked with a couple of products that have been developed beautifully, and they are really great pieces that solve no problems and have no commercial potential. And it's heartbreaking. And this is where, again, I feel like in our ecosystem, and I don't know, I'm in Australia, even though I don't sound like it. And I don't know if this is maybe a difference in ecosystems, but I find here in Australia that often founders, when they're, not in front of a VC with a meeting, but when they're talking to people at a cocktail party and that sort of thing, they just get a lot of fluffy, oh, that sounds great. If you get some traction, let us know. And people don't necessarily understand that's really a no. You don't take that as feedback that, oh, I should go pour my life savings into this. And so there's a responsibility on the prospective founder to educate themselves, but I don't feel that is actually available enough to them. So what do I want people to do? Yes, we know the failure rate, so let's try and fail fast. Let's do the things that don't actually require a build to work out maybe not this. I think that we don't spend enough time validating the problem. We go straight to, I'm solving this problem, and so I'm going to validate the solution. But actually, we need to spend more time in the problem space. And sometimes the solution that actually has got commercial potential is like 3 clicks to the left or the right of what you thought it was going to be. But if you've already built that thing, when you realize that, then it's really hard to emotionally and financially be able to do the course correct. So you just end up throwing more money on the fire. So more education, which means we need more people telling that story.
There's so much to unpack there. And, I think it touches on a bunch of themes that we've had on the podcast before. So one is validation and the curse of the MVP, probably the most harmful piece of terminology that has ever come into the world of startups, especially less experienced founders.
What about synergy? That's pretty bad.
Oh, well, synergy is just meaningless. MVP is actively harmful,
yes,
right? Because it is misleading. Because for one thing, it has the word product in it. So people think, MVP is a minimum viable product, which means I'm going to pour my life savings into creating something beautiful and fully functional that solves my view of a real problem. Whereas really an MVP should be called a prototype, which is what Marty Kagan calls them, or anything else. But the point is, what we should really be doing at the beginning, and the intention of the MVP, was validation. You've used that word a number of times, and it's completely correct. And frankly, whether you are well-funded and you're startup royalty, or you're a total outsider who doesn't have access to external funding, being rapid, frugal, and efficient with your upfront validation is critical.
Yes. Where I think some of the misinterpretation comes in is the scale at which these early stage founders need to do that. Because if you've already got money and you're in the throes of testing, then we want to ship really rapidly. We want to get that velocity going where we're putting stuff out and testing, because we can also afford to build stuff, throw it against the wall, and see if it sticks or not. But the mistake then I think that people make when they don't have the experience, the budget, is that they want to, as you said, they build really like the full first working version of a product before they show it to anybody. I call it unicorn in a box, right? Where they're like, I'm going to launch this. I'm never going to talk to another human being about it. And it's going to become a worldwide phenomenon. And of course, it doesn't happen.
It's like a social network that doesn't suck.
Yes, 100%. Look, I've been doing this for a while now, and I get pitched the same really bad ideas over and over. And I would say, the number 2 one is like some sort of LinkedIn replacement. And that's a really good example of like, yes, are there things about LinkedIn that we hate? Yes. Are we concerned about our privacy, etc.? Yes, same as other social networks. But no one has yet proven that people, as much as they hate that stuff, are prepared to pay a subscription to avoid it. And so when you come down to, that all sounds great, what's the commercial model here? Because if the notion is we're going to keep it private, we're not going to show you ads, we're going to protect your data, well, then that means you have to pay for it. What if that doesn't work? Well, then we have to sell ads, right? And so then it all just falls apart, right? I've worked with some things that have had serious money spent on them that I honestly think if I'd had 3 hours before they started, I could have said, don't do this. Like, this is not commercially viable. Let's find a different problem to solve. Let's find a different person to solve it for, that piece. So it's the scale. The principles are the same. And I think that is the piece where the examples are not always helpful to the early stage founder. Because when you say just ship it, then the person who's spending all their time developing something when they haven't talked to prospective customers yet is like, yeah, we need to get more releases out there, as opposed to you could actually test that with a little landing page. You could test it with a forum. You could build one feature and see if people will actually use it before you build the whole thing.
So to sort of fit this back into the episode about funding sources, I think if you're an early stage founder, right, we talked about self-funding, we talked about funding from customer revenue, we talked about equity funding from investors. And I think what we're both agreed on is that self-funding for a long time is bad, right? It is a massive concentration of risk, which means you have a fork in the road as an early stage founder, right? You need to either get your business, your startup, to the point where it is a business that is throwing off free cash flow or positive cash flow that can be invested back into it, right? So that you're not spending your own money anymore. You are spending money that you made from your customers. There are Silicon Valley style unicorn businesses that were grown that way. It is a more difficult road, but it's absolutely possible. But also you can create a fantastic, what is often called a lifestyle business. I know you hate that term. I hate that term too. But, a business that's not worth $1 billion. But what if you built a business that was worth $20 million or that threw off $3 million of revenue every year that you could just put straight into your pocket?
Yep.
That could be pretty good, right? So that's one option. Or the other option is to get your business to a point or get your startup to a point where you can raise external funding within a limited time frame. And if you get to the point where you are running a loss-making business, you're burning cash, and you still can't raise, you probably should stop rather than kind of succumbing to that sunk cost fallacy.
Yes.
And keep going and keep going. And to your point, quite often you could get there a lot earlier and realize, this thing is never going to be fundable. So, let's not even put in that initial 12 months of effort building this thing out, because I can actually figure out, from first principles that this startup is not going to be the sort of company that can receive outside funding.
And the reality is, for some people that are bootstrapping, is ultimately it's a hobby. They still have their day job. They've got enough money to be able to kind of play around with some things, and they like going to the events and that sort of stuff. And the line between vision and delusion is very thin, right? And I think you've got to have some level of really strong self-belief to even want to do this in the first place. But that piece of, like you said, of at what point, and this is a lot of what I work on with clients, and particularly in early founder education, is you've got to have those pivot or persevere points of where it's are we going to keep doing this? Does the data say we should do something else? Does the data say we should stop? And even though those can be hard to stick to, when you've got a partner involved, when it's your own money, you got to have those sort of guidelines and agreements for yourself and with the people that rely on you, that if we don't hit these milestones in this period of time, then we need to stop. Absolutely. But where I think that this is the thing that made me yell at the radio, there are a lot of deluded people out there that think they're going to get investment. And so they would listen to that and go, oh yeah, well, that's not me, because I've got the next unicorn and someone's going to drop out of the sky and give me that money, when the reality is the commercial model that it's built on is not something that funding can fix.
And because of that, it will not attract funding in the first place. So I think maybe one of the things we're circling around is the concept of an outsider founder, right? We did have an episode on this quite a while back. I think it can be a bit of an uncomfortable truth that the world of startups is not a level playing field. And this plays out in a few ways. One is in a sort of a very genuine way, which is experience matters. People who have a certain type of pedigree have a leg up on founders who don't have that pedigree, possibly because you could argue they are less likely to be deluded. They know how to do things, are less likely to go down blind alleys and things like that. And then secondly, and building on that, is those people are more likely to be funded, both for the legitimate reasons that they are, they have that pedigree, but also because of, less legitimate kind of, privilege, knowing the right people and so on. And so if you come into startups cold, you are, there's a problem you're passionate about, but you don't come from tech, you haven't built software before, you don't know any VCs, you don't know any developers, you can't code. Well, by definition, your startup is less likely to be successful. And even given that, it is even less likely to attract funding. And so, yeah, I think maybe what you're saying, Scotty, let me put the words in your mouth, is that you're worried that folks like that might listen to the previous episode of the Startup Podcast and not recognize that, although of course it is possible that they might attract venture capital funding, it's actually very unlikely, and it's certainly not something they should be hanging their hat on.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the stuff that talks about funding needs to come with the same kind of warnings that cigarettes or gambling, where it's like, you will probably lose, right? Like that, and that's the nature of it. So I think one type of founder that is very susceptible to falling into that trap is the kind of mid to later career professional who knows a lot about their industry, but has never started a tech business before. And so they come into it with an idea of scale and budget that they actually don't have, and with connections that they think are more valuable than they're actually going to be to them, because knowing an industry doesn't mean that you know how to sell to it. So I've worked with some people who have had some really high level concepts about selling to the industry that they'd come out of and learn too late that what they have, or, often they get meetings happening way too early. They start talking to those end goal customers before you have anything. And the bigger a company is, the less likely they are to be interested in trying something new. So you have the wrong meetings too soon. You do the wrong work too soon. And then if your runway, because sometimes they're renting an office, they've got people on salary and they're funding it themselves because their whole professional life has been like, that's just there and that's happened and that's how you do business, right? So that's how we're going to do it. And then the next thing you know, you're out on your ass in the street.
Okay, so yeah, you talked about the health warnings, right? One thing that occurs to me, like as an analogy, is a lot of countries have sophisticated investor laws, which actually prevent anybody who may want to from making things like angel investments and investing in more exotic securities. And, there are a lot of folks who disagree with such laws, right? But understand the intention behind them, which is that they are there to protect people from themselves. So, if you're a more like libertarian sort of bent, you're like, well, I shouldn't need to be protected from myself. But the intention there, it's not evil. It's not evil governments. It is governments that are saying, you know what? It is too easy for folks to get burnt on these investment schemes because they don't understand enough. They don't have enough money. And of course, there's a question of like, how do you evaluate what's a sophisticated investor as well? But the principle, right, is saying this stuff, not only is it toxic, but it is the sort of thing that, a lot of folks are going to be deluded into thinking that is okay for them. And it rarely is. So we're not going to let them do it. And I think what you're arguing for nearly is the equivalent of a sophisticated investor law, maybe like a sophisticated founder law, right? So we have our sophisticated founders. You know what? They can play the game of attracting funding and, doing that from fairly early on, doing some basic validation and then going and trying to raise a round. And, quite likely they will succeed, at least to get, that sort of pre-seed angel round. If they know what they're doing, they have a decent idea, they will probably be able to raise. But that doesn't mean that you, listener, who perhaps are not a sophisticated founder, which is not a knock on you, right? Just an observation. You don't have that inside track, that experience, that privilege. Doesn't mean that same playbook is necessarily right for you. And it doesn't cut out the possibility of going there and raising funding. But if you want to build a Silicon Valley style startup and you're coming at it with less experience, be aware that, the risk is much higher, your likelihood of success is lower. And especially in those early stages, Scotty, you have to play the game in a different way.
Exactly right. And I think that often, again, it's that pace or the scale at which you do that. One of the things, if you just go back and read your Lean Startup, we're learning. And so part of learning is failing. And part of working out that something doesn't work is actually a great result. And the sooner that you come to that conclusion, the more loosely that you hold on to your ideas in that testing phase, I think the more likely it is that you are going to land on something that actually has got potential because, rather than it's your very first baby and, it's the most beautiful thing that you've ever made and you're just going to prove everyone wrong. The more you do, the harder it is to let it go. So that phrase from writing about, kill your darlings, I think is really important in ideation, that we want to come up with as many ideas as possible. And I've used this analogy before that as a parent, you would never invite people around to look at your child and tell you everything that they think is wrong with it. My mother may have done that as she thought of it, but like a good parent would not do that, right? In fact, that's what you need to do with your ideas. You don't hold it close to your chest, make people sign NDAs, all that garbage. You actually ask people who know, what do you think? And tell me everything you don't like about this. Tell me everything you think could go wrong. If you do that out of the gate, it's much easier to let those things go than when you're a year down the track and you've already sunk your passion and money into it.
100% agree. And the funny thing is, you talk about failing and, that being part of the kind of process, is it's fractal, meaning that occurs at every level, including failing at building a startup itself, right? There's a reason why in Silicon Valley, people actually like failed founders, because you know what? They've learnt a bunch of really expensive lessons, and you can invest in them the next time and you don't have to pay that cost. They've already learnt those lessons. They've burnt their hands on the hot stove and they're going to have a better go at it the next time around. And so, you're Your startup is not your baby. The big difference between startups and babies is you shouldn't kill your babies, right? But startups, you often should.
I agree. We are aligned on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad
Very
we
pro
agree on
babies
that.
living.
But of course, you should kill most of your startup ideas, right? And quite often
Yes.
you should kill the startup itself, because once you kill one startup, you can start your next thing and you have somewhat of a clean slate. And so then the point is you should be doing that in an efficient way. Validation isn't just about getting to the right solution faster, it's about failing faster. That includes failing the entire thing, right? You've not failed as a person. The startup has failed. You go on to play the game again, start your next startup with those hard-won lessons.
Yes, I think, I'm a Walking Dead fan, and that in the zombie thing, sometimes someone's relative or loved one gets zombified, but they're like keeping them around because like they're fine, we're going to be able to cure them. There are people that drag, zombie businesses around like that, where everyone else is like, "Pu, that thing is dead," but you're like, "No, it's going to be fine." And it is that piece of just the longer that you hold on to it, the harder it is to let go.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
The other thing, though, I think, too, is that some of the learning is about whether or not you've actually got the risk appetite to do it. Because some people who have ideas, who think that they want to found a startup, get into it, and the uncertainty, and particularly the financial uncertainty, either just doesn't work for them fiscally, it doesn't work for them psychologically. We don't get out the calculator early enough, I think, with things, because it's all pie in the sky. And sometimes I'm always amazed when I talk to people who may have even made something, and when you talk to them about, so what are you going to charge for this? What do you think that the kind of revenue potential is? They're like, yeah, we haven't really thought about that yet. And that's like, I know sometimes people try and keep people away from that in the ideation stage or the idea development stage. But I think at some point you have to work out, okay, if I'm going to sell this as a subscription and I'm going to sell it for this, I've got to sell more subscriptions than there are people in Australia, or something, in order for it to be successful.
Well, it's one of those things. And, I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand the perspective that we have on this show. We rail against focusing on revenue too early. That means we rail against focusing on making that revenue too early, not on understanding what your business model could or should be, right? There needs to be a viable revenue model in the direction that you're heading, right? So, for example, yes, if you are creating a social network, you need to be thinking, okay, how can I monetize that thing? So, by the way, don't create a social network. That is not a good startup idea.
Terrible.
But, you need to be thinking, because, I do fundamentally believe if you're creating enough value in the world at sufficient scale, there are ways to capture that value through monetization. But you need to think about what those ways are, right? You don't want to kind of strangle your startup before it can achieve that sort of scale by focusing too much on monetizing your tiny little thing before it actually becomes viable. But it's absolutely the case that if you are building a technology startup, unless you're a not-for-profit or something, we're not the show for that, you are trying to build something that makes enormous profits at scale. And so if you can't see some sort of line of sight towards that, then you're not thinking about it the right way.
What better validation, though, is there that people will pay for it than someone paying for it?
That's a good question. What better validation? I think the point is that often by getting people to pay for something, you can suppress network effects that might actually make something more valuable. It can distract you from other things that are more important to de-risk. So, for example, if you're going to charge for something, then you need to think about pricing. Pricing is actually a really complicated topic. If you get your pricing wrong, you might find that you've killed your product, even though there's value there and you could generate revenue from it. And so, one of the things that we talk about on this podcast is about the process of building a startup being around progressive de-risking, right? You identify the biggest risk to the startup's success and you try to eliminate that one first, and then the next one and the next one. And the point is that monetization is not always, or not even most of the time, in my view, the biggest risk. The biggest risk, to your point, Scotty, is that nobody wants to use the thing, right? Or it doesn't provide any value, or people, stuff like that. And so it's not a question of what better validation. I would argue that there probably is no better validation. but that doesn't mean that it is right, because it might not be the biggest risk.
No, I understand. I think obviously, if we're talking B2C, B2B, those pieces are different. And there are things that you can, I think you mentioned this in the episode, it might start off more as a service and turn into a scalable, platform, etc. And I think sometimes those ways of, okay, rather than having to build the whole thing to work out if people will pay for this, if people will pay for a more manual version of this service, or we'll use this in a white glove way, etc., that particularly on the B2B side can be a way to do that. B2C obviously is a volume game where you're unlikely to, if you start taking $8 a month subscriptions right away. I understand your point completely, but again, and I don't know if this is the US VC market, but our VC ecosystem here in Australia, which is pretty small, a lot of the VCs here don't have a lot of money, and they actually want people that already are demonstrating traction through revenue. And so it's a bit of a mixed message, I think. And I don't know if that's cultural or...
I think it depends on the VC. And I think there are other ways to demonstrate traction. I agree that there are some VCs that are too focused on demonstrating traction via revenue. And that can actually cause startups to fail to achieve their full potential. And, I really do believe that, because they end up distracting themselves. They're building something that has demonstrable value, but instead of focusing on that value, they focus on how to squeeze revenue out of, a relatively small customer base or whatnot, prioritizing features that might lead to some easy money rather than features that actually have that world-changing potential that leads to the sort of returns that these funds look for. So I think it's really interesting. One of the problems with VC, as an aside here, right, is that it has very, very long feedback cycles, right? That is understood. You can't tell if a VC is making good investment decisions for minimum 5, often more than 10 years, right? And my hypothesis is that the VCs that focus too much on early revenue, like we're talking about, pre-seed and seed stage, focusing on revenue, are going to have substandard returns. That is my belief, because they're going to invest in a bunch of small businesses that haven't really thought about what the big picture is.
And I think that's where making sure that people understand that chasing VC is a choice, that, in terms of their own, what do they want from their life, their business, etc. The first tech company that I worked in, because I came out of education, was a family-owned business that had never taken any investment, had no external stakeholders, but had a really nice market. And as a younger product person, I felt like they weren't ambitious enough. It's like, we could do this, we could go for this, tender, etc. And then one day they said to me, our goal is we want to make sure that we are providing for our families and for, their long-term, but also that we can look our employees in the eye every day and be confident that we know that we can pay them for the next 12 months. That was going back a while now. And that they just sold their company for, not hundreds of millions of dollars, but for life-changing kind of money. And they've really enjoyed the journey along the way. And so where I think, when we then say, well, you're not playing the startup game, it's like, oh, okay, sure. You're not playing the Silicon Valley game. But when you look at how many things actually become a unicorn, there's a difference between, we know that a lot of things are going to fail, or that we're setting up 99% of people for failure by saying, you have to chase this, as opposed to there are options to you.
Agreed. Now, I wanted to backtrack on something that you said, and it might be a good place to start to wrap things up here, Scotty. So what you were talking about is the fact that a lot of folks don't understand the risk that they're taking when they do a startup, and that perhaps they don't have the risk profile to be doing this. What often happens is maybe people fall in love with a specific problem, but it doesn't mean that they are right to be founders. And so I guess, a question for you is, do you think you see a lot of people who are founders who should not be startup founders?
I think it's more that they don't understand the runway that they might need, or that they're trying to do it at a time in their life that may not actually be the best thing for them financially. I think that the people that are just in love with the idea of being a founder disappear fairly quickly, because it's really, really hard work. I think that we have got a bias towards a certain type of founder that makes it harder for some people who really should be able to do it to be founders. I work with a couple of really neurodivergent people who cannot work with a co-founder. They're a visionary. They can work with advisors, that sort of thing. And VCs will look at them and go, oh, you need a co-founder. You need a co-founder. And those things, but I still wouldn't say that they shouldn't be. I think the main thing is really, if you've got the risk appetite for it and the runway to do it without sacrificing your financial long-term well-being, which I've seen people do, then people should, if they want to have a go, but understand that you may go through a lot of money before you succeed or realize you can't do it. Whenever someone says, I've been my own angel investor, that always makes me nervous, because that is not money you're going to get back.
At least those folks have that level of self-knowledge that that's what they're doing. I think a lot of folks don't think of it that way. They just think, oh, I'm doing a startup, and then, they're slowly remortgaging their house for it. And that's even worse. But I guess, maybe to sort of put a bow on this, incorporating your response there, Scotty, is probably our favorite phrase on the Startup Podcast is know the game you're playing.
Love it.
Now, the game of being a tech startup founder, firstly, there are a number of different versions of the game. That's one of the things we're talking about. But all of them are very risky. All of them are likely to result in failure. All of them require a high tolerance for risk and uncertainty. And it's not enough just to have fallen in love with a problem and be excited about shipping a solution. You need to understand that in doing that, you are going to have to accept the whole bundle of what it means to be a startup founder. Yes. And really internalize that and accept that that is the game that you're playing. And, understand that also yourself as a player, right? We're talking about the outsider founders versus the insider founders. Understand your strengths and weaknesses as a player and adjust your approach to the game appropriately. And that way you're most likely to have a strong correspondence between your ambitions and the reality that you face.
Awesome. I appreciate the right of reply.
It wasn't a right, mate. It was a privilege.
It was oh, that's right. It was an incredible privilege. No, seriously, I love the work that you do. And I think that there are so many, and this is the thing that I often have said to you, it's like most of what you put out there is stuff that everybody needs to hear. And then there'll be this little caveat where I'm like, no, you're ruining lives.
Don't ruin your lives, folks.
Don't ruin your lives. And if you do, don't blame the Startup Podcast.
Scotty, you are the warning label. So we will put a warning label on future episodes of TSP.
I think that could actually warn people away. With no context even, they'd be like, oh, I don't want to do that. So that might be a good idea.
All right. That was a lot of fun, Scotty. So if folks want to connect with you or find out what you're up to, where's the best place for them to seek you out?
Look, please don't come to my house. LinkedIn is better.
Where do you live?
Yeah. No. LinkedIn is better. Scotty Allen on LinkedIn or theproductbus.com. Very happy to have a chat about your idea and lovingly tell you what I really think about it.
Fantastic. I couldn't think of a better person to give you that tough love than you, Scotty. And folks, if you want to follow what I do, I'm mostly on LinkedIn trying to make it a less boring place. I love connection requests from TSP listeners, so let me know that that's who you are, and I will gladly accept your connection. All right, that was a lot of fun, Scotty. Hope to have you on again in the future, and all the best for 2025.
Thank you.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.